My parents canceled my engagement party over my sister's breakup, but my aunt's unexpected gift made my whole family furious. 2 weeks ago, my boyfriend of 5 years, Elliot, 27M, proposed to me, 27F, and of course, I said yes. When we shared the news with our families, they were thrilled, overjoyed, really. My parents even announced that they would be throwing us an engagement party, which I was really looking forward to. But then, out of nowhere, just a few days ago, they canceled the whole thing without even talking to me first. The reason? My younger sister, Tessa, 25F, had just gone through a breakup. Now, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't have minded hosting and paying for my own engagement party if it had come to that. But my parents had made a promise, and then they just went back on it without a word. That's what upset me. If they had at least talked to me beforehand, I would have understood, even if I didn't agree. But instead, they just called me up and dropped the news as if it were no big deal. They told me that Tessa and her boyfriend had broken up just a day before, and because she was completely devastated, they had decided it would be best to avoid any talk of my wedding until she was back in a relationship. Since she was too upset, an engagement party for me was apparently out of the question. The party was supposed to happen yesterday, and invitations had already gone out a week ago. But none of that mattered because my parents had already pulled the plug again, without even consulting me. That really hurt. I might have understood their reasoning a little more if Tessa had been in a long-term relationship, but she had only been dating this guy for 8 months. Sure, she was serious about him, but clearly, he wasn't on the same page. And the kicker? The reason they broke up was because Tessa, after finding out about my engagement, straight up asked him if he saw himself marrying her anytime soon. Now, that's a lot to spring on a guy, especially after less than a year of dating. I can't even blame him for walking away. He'd apparently already told her multiple times that she needed to slow down, but she wouldn't listen. So, honestly, that breakup was on her. Yet, somehow, my parents decided that my engagement party had to be cancelled because of this? It made no sense. When I told them how unfair their decision was, I even called their reasoning stupid and petty. That, of course, didn't sit well with them, and we ended up in a huge argument. Since then, we haven't spoken. I had given my parents a guest list for the invitations, but since they cancelled the party without warning, I had to email everyone myself and tell them it was postponed indefinitely. I wasn't going to let this stop me from celebrating, I just didn't know when I'd be able to reschedule since I now had to plan everything from scratch. But here's where things took an unexpected turn. There was one person who never got disinvited, someone my parents and I had both forgotten about. And, honestly, that worked out in my favor. That person was my aunt, my dad's older sister. She's a bit of a mystery, living mostly off the grid. No social media, no personal emails, she only uses email for formal business matters. If you want to reach her, you have to do it the old-fashioned way, by calling. Even when we sent her the original invitation, we had to mail it to her and then follow up with a phone call. But after the fight with my parents, neither of us remembered to tell her that the party was cancelled. So, yesterday, she showed up at my parents' house, expecting a celebration. Now, this was bad news for them because my aunt isn't just any family member, she's strict, and more importantly, she controls a significant inheritance that my dad has been eyeing for years. My father, 51M, is the youngest of 3 siblings. My aunt, 62F, is the eldest, and we also had an uncle in the middle, but he passed away a few years ago. My aunt always had a soft spot for my dad, probably because he was the youngest. By the time he was born, my grandparents were already in their late 30s, and to be honest, he wasn't exactly a planned pregnancy. They weren't able to give him as much attention as he probably needed, so my aunt stepped in and took on that role. Even as adults, she remained a constant presence in his life. She never married or had kids, but she built a successful career and now runs her own business. My dad had always assumed that when she passed, he would inherit everything. She had even discussed it with him before. If she was going to leave her assets to someone, it would be him. But after yesterday, that may no longer be the case. When she arrived at my parents' house and realized the party wasn't happening, they had no choice but to explain why. I guess they thought their reasoning made perfect sense, but my aunt didn't see it that way. She immediately called them out, telling them how ridiculous it was to cancel my engagement party over something like this. Then, she left and came straight to my place. I was more than happy to see her because we get along really well, even though we don't talk as often as we should. I usually call to check in on her every now and then, and when we do talk, it's always nice. I hadn't planned on telling her about my falling out with my parents, but she was the one who brought it up. She didn't hold back, either. She told me outright that after what they did, I shouldn't even invite them to my wedding at all. If they didn't respect me enough to keep their promises, why should they be included? That caught me off guard. My whole life, I had only ever seen her getting along great with my dad, but last night, she seemed genuinely angry. When I asked what was really going on, it became clear that there was more to her frustration than just my engagement party. She told me that, as the oldest sibling, she had made a lot of sacrifices growing up. Her parents never really acknowledged them, though. They just expected it from her, as if it was her duty to put her brothers before herself. And for most of her life, she believed that was how things were supposed to be. But now, looking back, she regrets not taking more time for herself. Over time, my aunt started realizing that she was the only one making an effort to keep in touch with my dad. He never reached out to her unless he needed something. She had always tried to excuse it, telling herself that he had a family to take care of and couldn't set aside as much time for her as she did for him. But even with that in mind, it still hurt. And honestly, I completely understood where she was coming from. I've always felt that my dad doesn't call or visit her nearly as much as he should. Plus, at this point, my sister and I are adults, we're doing just fine on our own. He can't really use family responsibilities as an excuse anymore. Then, my aunt opened up about something she had never really talked about before. When she was younger and my grandparents were still alive, there had been a clear favorite in the family, and it wasn't her or my dad. It was their middle brother. He was the golden child, simply because he was a boy. And honestly, if my father had been a little older at the time, it probably would have been him instead. Her entire life, she had felt like she had been given the short end of the stick, not just by her parents, but by her siblings too. And now, she wanted to make sure I didn't make the same mistakes. She told me that once you start forgiving people just because they're family, they begin to take advantage of it. And eventually, it reaches a point where you can't turn back. Everything she said really hit me hard, because deep down, I knew she was right. Until that conversation, I had been holding on to this idea that, by the time my wedding rolled around, things would somehow work themselves out. I hadn't figured out exactly how. I just assumed my parents would eventually apologize, or that even if they didn't, I would let it go. Because, at the end of the day, I wanted them to be there. But after talking to my aunt, I realized I wasn't actually okay with what they had done. I wasn't just going to sweep it under the rug. I needed them to acknowledge how wrong they had been and apologize. Until that happened, I didn't want them involved in my wedding or in my life, for that matter. I wasn't about to let them walk all over me. So, after my aunt left that night, I sent a message to my parents and Tessa, making it clear where I stood. I told them that until they admitted their mistake and apologized, I had no interest in having them be part of my wedding in any way. I also asked them to stay away. This morning, when I told my aunt about the message, she told me she was proud of me. She said she really hoped I'd be able to work things out with my family one day, but until then, I needed to stand my ground. She was right. Since she lives pretty far away, I had insisted she stay the night rather than drive back late. So, when we talked this morning, it was in person. Before she left, she mentioned something that stuck with me. She was disappointed. After she scolded my dad last night, he hadn't even bothered to call her, let alone try to make amends. I could tell it hurt her. And honestly, I got it. Both of us were feeling pretty let down by our families. A few hours later, my dad showed up at my door. The first thing he asked was if my aunt was still there. I told him she had already left earlier that morning and that she had been disappointed he hadn't reached out to her at all after their argument. The second I said that, he snapped. Right there on my doorstep, he started yelling at me, blaming me for everything. He was convinced that I had turned my aunt against him. Apparently, she had just called him and told him that, given his recent behavior, she was changing her will. She would no longer be leaving her inheritance to him. Instead, she had decided to leave everything to me. It was a huge deal. Like I said before, the inheritance she's leaving behind is significant. My dad had always assumed he would get it, so hearing this news hit him hard. But the only person he had to blame was himself. I lost my temper too. I told him he had no right to stand there and yell at me, especially when all of this was a direct result of his own actions. If he had just had the decency to pick up the phone and talk to his sister after their fight, maybe things wouldn't have gone this far. I never even asked him to apologize, just reaching out to her would have been enough. But he hadn't even done that. Even today, the only reason he had come all the way to my house wasn't because he cared about making things right with her, it was because she had told him she was cutting him out of the will. That's what mattered to him. I told him straight up, he deserved this. For years, everyone had seen how my aunt was always the one trying to stay in touch, while he barely made an effort. He had no right to complain now. And he sure as hell didn't have the right to act like I was the villain in all of this, especially after what he and my mom did with the engagement party. I also made it clear that I didn't have to say anything to my aunt to turn her against them. She was already angry when she showed up at my place. In fact, it was her idea that I cut ties with them until they apologized. I didn't have to do anything to make them look bad, they had done that just fine on their own. My dad looked completely caught off guard. His first instinct was to accuse me of lying, he just couldn't wrap his head around the idea that his beloved sister would actually take a stand against him. But the truth was, he had done this to himself. At that point, I was done. I told him to leave. But instead of walking away, he just broke down, right there on my doorstep. Through his tears, he said I had turned the only family he had against him. My dad looked genuinely shaken, more upset than I'd ever seen him before. Through his tears, he told me that canceling the engagement party wasn't nearly as bad as what I had done to him. He said that if my aunt seemed so angry with him, the least I could have done was reach out and invite him over so we could have sorted things out as a family. I had never heard my father cry like that before. The way he broke down this morning has been replaying in my head ever since. Even though he left after a few minutes, I can't seem to shake the guilt. A part of me wonders if things would have been different had I reached out last night. Maybe if I had called him over, we could have cleared the air together instead of just venting to my aunt. Maybe that just made us more bitter. But at the same time, I don't think I did anything wrong. I was hurt, and I confided in someone who cared about me. There's nothing wrong with that. Still, the guilt lingers. Elliot, my fiancé, doesn't think I did anything wrong either. But I wanted a second opinion. Was I really in the wrong for not calling my father and trying to smooth things over with my aunt? Edit, a look at the bigger picture. My parents weren't always like this. That's the reason I even maintained a relationship with them for so long, because growing up, they were different. For most of my life, my sister and I were treated equally. There was no blatant favoritism, no special treatment just because Tessa was younger. But over the past few years, something shifted. I held on to the hope that this was just a phase, that they would eventually go back to treating us the way they used to. But now, I see how unlikely that is. If I had to pinpoint when it all started changing, it would be around the time Tessa graduated from college. She struggled to find a job because of COVID and ended up in a deep depression. For nearly a year, she barely left her room some days. At that time, she was still living with our parents, while I was with Elliot. Because of quarantine, we didn't see each other much beyond video calls. I think that period softened my parents toward her in a way that never fully went back to normal. They saw her as fragile, as someone who needed extra care. And that was fine, I understood why they wanted to support her. But in the process, they forgot that they had 2 daughters, and both of us needed them. It's frustrating, but there's nothing I can do about it. And honestly, it has affected my relationship with Tessa too. We used to have a pretty normal sibling dynamic. Sure, there was some rivalry, but nothing too serious. But over the past few years, she's changed. She's become entitled, acting as if she's more important than me, probably because that's how our parents treat her. I ignored it for a long time, but after everything that's happened, I don't think I can anymore. Update 1. After reading all the comments and advice I received, I've decided that I don't need to reach out to my dad or apologize to him. I don't know why he thinks I owed it to him to call and invite him over when my aunt came to talk to me. He had his own opportunity to make things right before she even showed up at my place. She had been with him. He could have used that time to acknowledge his mistake, apologize to me, and clear things up with her. But he chose not to. Instead, he doubled down, acting as if everything he did was justified. So, for him to turn around now and try to blame me for how things played out is ridiculous. It's been a couple of days now, and at first, it was just my dad showing up at my door, blaming me for what happened. But now, my mom and Tessa have joined in too. They're all accusing me of deliberately sabotaging his relationship with his sister, of brainwashing her against him. Luckily, they haven't shown up at my house, at least, not yet. But at this point, I wouldn't put it past them. What bothers me the most is that my dad knows the truth. He knows I didn't say anything to turn my aunt against him. She was already upset when she came to me. She even told him on the phone that it was his behavior that had pushed her away, not me. But despite that, they're still making this about me. They want to paint me as the villain, as if I'm out for revenge. It's petty, and I know they're only doing this to get under my skin, and unfortunately, it's working. I've even blocked them, but that hasn't stopped them from finding ways to harass me. They've been using burner phones and fake social media accounts to keep trying to get in touch. At this point, I don't even know what they want from me. I don't think an apology would even fix anything. Elliot thinks they want me to talk to my aunt and convince her to forgive them. That until I do, they're just going to keep pushing, keep finding ways to get on my nerves. And honestly, I think he's right. But there is no way I'm going to do that. I'm not going to beg my aunt to make peace with people who refuse to take responsibility for their actions. If they want to make things right with her, they'll have to do it themselves. I want no part in it. At this point, I've accepted that I just have to tough it out and deal with whatever my family throws my way. As long as they stay away from me and don't show up at my doorstep, I can handle it. Update 2. Since their attempts to harass me on social media weren't working, my family decided to take things a step further. Instead of just bothering me directly, they started reaching out to extended relatives, trying to turn them against me. Apparently, from what I've gathered through a few family members, my parents and Tessa have been spreading lies about me. They've been telling everyone that if they ever get invited to any event I host in the future, they should decline because I'm a hateful and petty person. They're claiming that I manipulated my aunt and fed her lies to turn her against them. The version of events they've been telling people is completely different from the truth. According to them, my parents had politely asked me to postpone the engagement party since Tessa had just gone through a terrible breakup. But instead of respecting their wishes, I supposedly decided to go ahead with the party anyway. And because they didn't approve of that, they told me I'd have to pay for it myself, at which point, they claim, I threw a fit and called my aunt to manipulate her into taking my side. Now, because of me, my dad has lost contact with his own sister. The way they're spinning this makes me look like some entitled brat who demanded that they fund my party. But I never asked them to pay for anything in the first place. They offered to host the engagement party. And then, out of nowhere, they took it back and canceled everything behind my back. At first, I spent time clarifying things whenever someone reached out to ask about the situation. But after a while, it got exhausting. I was tired of constantly having to defend myself. So, I decided to put out a public statement on my social media, explaining exactly what had happened. I figured it was better to address everything at once rather than keep having the same conversation over and over. Until now, I had been trying to avoid dragging my aunt into this mess. She doesn't have social media, and she likes to stay away from all the unnecessary drama. But things were getting out of control, and I felt like I had no choice but to reach out and let her know what was happening. I needed her to take a stand, not just for me but for herself, to let people know that she had cut my dad off because of his actions, not because I manipulated her. When I told her everything, she wasn't surprised. She said she was going to call my father and tell him directly that his behavior was only pushing her further away. She also reassured me that I didn't have to worry. If they wanted to take this fight public, she would, too. And she did exactly that. She even created a Facebook account just for this purpose, posting a video to set the record straight. She made it clear that I had nothing to do with her decision and that it was entirely because of how my father had treated her. She wanted everyone in the family to know that I wasn't the one in the wrong. After her post, things shifted. People started reaching out to me, showing their support and telling me they were done with my father as well. They saw his behavior for what it was, petty and manipulative. It was one thing to have issues with me, but to drag the entire family into it and try to paint me as the villain was unacceptable. I had been skeptical about whether people would even believe my side of the story since my dad had always been well liked. But I was relieved to see that people stood by what was right. And as for my parents and Tessa? They had nothing to say. A couple of hours ago, I started hearing from relatives that all of them had deactivated their social media accounts. I guess they realized that if they stayed online, they'd have to answer for their behavior. Honestly? I don't care. I'm just glad that the truth is out and that no one can accuse me of being the bad guy anymore. And even if some people still want to, that's their problem, not mine. I've said everything I needed to say, and now, I'm done with this nonsense. I have a wedding to plan, and I refuse to waste another second on petty drama. Elliot and I talked it over, and we've decided to take down all the posts we made about this situation in a few days. It's out in the open now, and it no longer matters to us. My aunt is planning to delete her account, too. None of us want this negativity lingering in our lives. She also gave me one final piece of advice. Even if my family tries to reach out again, whether to fight or to apologize, I should let it go and not respond. She said it would be for the best. And honestly? I couldn't agree more. Update 3, moving forward. Hey everyone, just wanted to give a final update. I'm getting married in a couple of weeks. I recently sent out the invitations, and, of course, my parents and Tessa didn't receive one. After everything that happened, they never even tried to reach out and make things right. And honestly, even if they had, I doubt I would have been open to it. The things they did, the lies, the smear campaign, went beyond just a family disagreement. After the whole ordeal, nearly everyone in the family distanced themselves from my parents and sister. They reactivated their social media accounts a few days after the dust settled and even tried again to start another wave of hate against me. But at that point, no one was falling for it anymore. Since then, things have been quiet, and I'm grateful for that. I've been busy planning my wedding, and to be honest, I haven't even been thinking about my family. It wasn't until I sent out the invitations that it really hit me. I hadn't spoken to them in months. It felt strange, but there was nothing I could do about it. I talked to my aunt about how I was feeling, and she reassured me that it was normal. She said I was supposed to feel like I was missing out on something, because I was. I was going to miss out on the experience of having my parents at my wedding, and it was okay to feel bad about that. But the important thing to remember was why they wouldn't be there. They had shown me, time and time again, that they didn't respect me. That's why they weren't invited. That helped shift my perspective. So, no, I won't pretend that I don't care that they won't be at my wedding. I do care. But I also know that there's nothing I can do to change the situation. The only thing left to do is accept it and move forward. And even though they won't be there, I'll still be surrounded by people who love and support me, Elliot, my aunt, and so many others. So no matter what, it's going to be a beautiful day.